Stay informed on all the news that matters most to the military community with a subscription to Stars and Stripes Digital Access. As a subscriber, you'll enjoy unlimited access to the Stripes.com website and our Stars and Stripes mobile apps, updated 24/7 by reporters stationed at military bases around the globe. Subscribe today and enter the promo code PODCAST when signing up for a yearly subscription and receive 50% off your first year. Get exclusive access to special features, interactive articles, award-winning photography, and more. Visit stripes.com/digital and enter the promo code PODCAST to subscribe today. This is Force for Hire,
a deep dive into private military contracting and how it's transforming the battlefield.
I'm Michelle Harvin.
And I'm Desmond Ferris. We've talked a bit about a population of contractors referred to as third country nationals, or TCNs, in past episodes. TCNs refer to those who are not working in their home country, nor are they working for a company that's headquartered in their home country. So essentially, this is a migrant workforce. It's hard not to talk about government contracting without mentioning them because they make up such a huge portion of the labor force.
During the first quarter of 2019, U.S. Central Command reported over 24,000 third country nationals supporting the Department of Defense, while around 21,700 contractors were U.S. citizens. Third country nationals play a key role in conflicts across the globe. But while the industry increasingly relies on these workers, they're often kept in the shadows. They're subcontracted out to a convoluted degree, and there are seldom ever data or stats of the group made public. This lack of clarity means they're vulnerable to abuses.
Human trafficking remains a huge issue for these workers. In 2010, the co-chair for the Commission of Wartime Contracting, Christopher Shea, said the treatment of foreign workers is a human rights abuse that cannot be tolerated. And just last year, the nonpartisan watchdog Project on Government Oversight identified 2 companies sanctioned by the U.S. government for human trafficking violations. And this is all just the tip of the iceberg.
For this episode, we wanted to talk all about one of the most impacted communities of government contracting and the issues they face. For that, we turn first to James Sinclair, a lawyer and researcher in modern slavery and global labor exploitation. We started with the sort of jobs third country nationals typically do.
TCNs have been used, increasingly used over the course of the last 25 years or so, to undertake usually support service work in conflict and post-conflict environments. So these are people who are frequently doing the lower end jobs, lower skilled jobs. We're talking about people doing static guarding, cleaners, construction workers, etc., and they're typically sourced from countries in the global south where wage rates tend to be significantly below that which you'd expect in Europe or the US.
Okay, and so this is generally low-wage sort of work, but they're performing essential tasks. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been written several times by researchers that the contractors, effectively, certainly the U.S. military, and I think now it's unarguably the case that the U.K. and European militaries simply couldn't do what they want to do in overseas theatres of operation without the support of contractors. And the contractorized work, a big part of the contractorized workforce, are third country nationals who are there doing the day-to-day jobs, the things that that need to be done. Whether it's laundry and DFAC services, or, as I say, construction, security, and all sorts of other things.
And so, how connected are third country nationals to, say, American and UK companies or bases?
So particularly the big defense contractors use TCNs all the time for the sorts of work that we're talking about, because we have a competitive environment for contracting, both in the UK context where I'm from, but also most particularly in the US. The big defense contractors, big security contractors are competing with each other principally on price, but also on service delivery. And so that a significant component of that price will be the wages that are paid to the workers that you employ for the project. A significant number of those workers will be TCNs in the lower paid jobs. And so if you can get workers to work on your projects for $100 a month less than your competitors, then you obviously can eke out a significant competitive advantage in that bidding environment.
What issues that third country nationals are running up against? What sort of abuses are happening here?
So the worker will be paying for their job. And that payment will vary depending on the type of project that we're talking about, the wage rates, etc., the risk profile of the job. But it's typically somewhere between about $2,000 and $6,000. And the worker themselves will not typically have the money to pay that, and so they will often be offered what we call a debt bond contract, which is why the phenomenon is known as debt bondage or bonded labour, and they will be asked. Well, they will sign a contract where they will have to pay back the principal loan that they are receiving in order to pay the bribe or the fee for their job, plus interest, and that interest is somewhere usually between 35 and 50% per year. And so the worker then goes through a process of recruitment where they are, having paid for their job, they're essentially guaranteed to get the job. They will then move through the usual paperwork and then will end up on the job site in this sort of context in Iraq or Afghanistan, where they will then start their job and they will repay their loan over a period of anything between 6 months and 18 months or 2 years, during which time the money that they're sending home to their family in remittance will be reduced, obviously, by the amount of the loan repayments. The fact that they are indebted to a moneylender who will know where their family lives, and this, the worker will be several thousand miles away from home, will have no support network. Now, these are people who are put in a very vulnerable position. One thing that's worth noting is that it's really important not simply to view the workers in this context as being purely victims. They're people with agency. They're often making a very calculated judgment about the fact that this might be, in their perception, the only way of accessing work, and therefore they know that they're being exploited in this sense, but they take the view that it's still worthwhile them doing the job because they need to send remittance money back home to their families. And this is a calculation that migrant workers all over the world make every day. It's a very complex situation to try to understand and then try to help in terms of legislation or other forms of rules.
Does paying these dues still makes taking these jobs worth it, even though at the end they're ending up with debt?
Well, this is the calculation that the recruiters make when they're setting the fee rates for the jobs that they are hawking out. And I should say that there is another element to this, which is that the corruption doesn't end with the recruitment. The recruiter will, in many cases, be offering bribes to various people up and down the supply chain. So there may be local law enforcement who need to be bribed. There may be people within the company that is ordering the workers that also demands or wants to be paid some of the money that is being generated by these fees. And bearing in mind that the bonded labour and modern slavery as a general sort of operation manages to generate about $150 billion a year of illicit profits, and bonded labour is the single biggest commercial element of that exploitation. So we're talking about a lot of money here. But the fees themselves will be set usually with the ultimate job and the repayment or the remuneration for that job in mind. And so the worker will be sitting and thinking, okay, well, this job is promising to pay me $1,000 or $800 a month. The work that I could access locally would pay me no more than, say, $400 a month. And so the delta between those two, plus the interest, becomes, or rather the delta between the two is weighed up against the debt bond plus the interest. And so a calculation will be made.
A lot of these third country nationals are working on American bases, or working with American and UK service members or other contractors. Why don't the rules or codes that we have in place protect these workers or prevent this workforce from being taken advantage of?
Well, there have been some very significant and encouraging improvements to the sort of the legal frameworks that surround these issues over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. There've been the federal acquisition regulations have improved markedly. President Obama in 2013 made a very direct executive order about human trafficking, of which bonded labor is a part. And modern slavery, and that there are laws now that cover the movement of people with the intention of exploitation, which is essentially the definition of human trafficking, and those laws are increasingly being looked at by lawyers and investigators and others who are seeking to try to bring more accountability into this space. But nothing yet really biting hard on what we know to be happening in the security space, and some of this is because it's quite difficult to gather evidence about this, not least because the workers themselves are very reluctant to talk about it, and that reluctance comes from several things. They first of all may not perceive that they are being exploited because the bonded labor paradigm is so endemic in the recruitment and management of migrant workers that they don't see it necessarily as being exploitation. It's just the status quo. It's how things are. But even if they are aware that they're being exploited in a way that's contrary to law, and this is, let's be clear, this practice is contrary to law in almost every country in the world, they may very well determine that it's not worth their time talking to lawyers or investigators about their case because it's unlikely to do them much good. It might, if migrant workers en masse were to seek to bring class actions or to talk to the media, then that may have the effect of changing the culture. But unfortunately, when individual workers are faced with the choice of, do I speak up about what's happening to me, or do I keep quiet? There is a lot of pressure on them to keep quiet, and that pressure comes from the fact that they might lose their job and be sent home with a debt they can't repay, essentially in shame and disgrace to their family. They might face physical threats of reprisals from the money lenders and the labour agents. They might get into trouble with their bosses. They might like their job and they might want to lose it. They might see this as a longer term opportunity. There's all sorts of push and pull factors, which means that gathering evidence in this space is not easy.
And let's talk about your personal experience. How did you get started looking at this migrant workforce in the defense industry?
Well, I was just working as a jobbing lawyer back in 2005. I qualified as a lawyer in the UK in 2001, and I'd spent a few years in private practice doing things entirely unrelated to the defense industry. And then I met and became friends with a gentleman called Tristan Forster. And Tristan had been a Gurkha officer, a major in the Gurkha regiments of the British Army. And he was then working for a company in Iraq, looking after various sort of VIPs and areas of critical national infrastructure for a security company. And he and I started talking about some of the practices that he was then seeing around the employment of migrant workers. And this was something that was particularly dear to him because a lot of the people that he was seeing coming into the theatre then were themselves ex-Gurkhas. And Tristan, who obviously speaks fluent Nepali, was able to speak to a lot of them about their experience and started to understand the sort of full panoply of what we would now categorize as modern slavery. And came to me and said, look, as a lawyer, what could we do about this? And it was that moment that I looked around at the legal landscape and we realized that the law wasn't going to help us much. And so we decided that perhaps the most effective intervention that we could then make would be to set up an ethical recruitment company. In other words, a company that was specifically aimed at recruiting migrant workers, and particularly ex-Gurkhas, in a way that you or I would like to be recruited. So not being charged for jobs, having complete transparency about the job they were going to, making sure they were well insured, they were well managed, their welfare was taken care of, etc. And we did that because we felt that it was, I suppose, morally the right thing to do, but also, frankly, we saw what we thought was a commercial opportunity, because at that time there were, I think, no dedicated ethical recruiters in this space, and we felt that once this story became more widely known, US, UK government agencies, private companies, who were employing migrant workers would want to have an ethical and transparent and legally compliant way of recruiting their workforces. So in 2006 we set up FSI worldwide, and FSI is still going strong today. It wasn't quite the sort of the beginning of the radical change we were hoping for. We would have thought by now, the space would be teeming with ethical recruiters falling over themselves to offer better services, but it hasn't quite worked like that. And unfortunately, it's still the case that most contractors are sourcing their workers from labor brokers who may very well be licensed in their country of origin, but who are often engaged in bonded and other forms of labor exploitation.
And I remember when we were talking before, you mentioned when you first started out talking with these workers, and when you said that there was not a fee that they would walk out, that it was so confusing, or they just thought it wasn't legitimate.
There is an almost tragic sort of anticipation that exploitation inevitably will follow if people are looking for work overseas. And therefore, we've had people breaking down in tears and almost begging us to take money from them, because the workers perceive that to be the only way of guaranteeing the job. And when we try to explain that we're a fee-free recruiter, we are paid by the employer. We do not accept money from the employee. Sometimes known as the employer pays principle. They don't fully understand, because particularly in some of the countries we work, such as Nepal, the recruitment for overseas work is so endemically infected with bonded labor that it's very hard to get people to understand that there is a different model. And so sometimes workers assume that it's a trap or a trick, or that so we must have some other form of nefarious intent towards them. And it takes quite a lot of explanation for us to be able to say, no, this is how we do it. And we often conduct interviews, obviously with video cameras, and we make sure that people are have seen copies of their contract and signed copies of their contract before they're recruited. And we're increasingly looking at things like smart contracts and other forms of technology that can sort of try and cut out some of this corruption. But you're exactly right. Unfortunately, one of the big issues is getting over the fact that people still see a payment as being a way of accessing a job for sure, when if they don't pay, they don't, being selected on merit is still quite an unusual thing for overseas work.
And with FSI Worldwide, you mentioned that the companies are paying you then to recruit. With these other recruitment services, you mentioned that they may be getting paid in a different way. Is there a loss of incentive then to be working in an ethical way?
So a few years ago now, so going back about a decade or so, the rules changed, which meant that you could no longer essentially bid for US government contracts unless you could demonstrate that you had a reasonable budget, which was then, I think, about $300 per man, budgeted for recruitment of TCNs. So before that, you could essentially say, you could put a price in which included the fact that you were not paying for recruitment. If you weren't paying for it, then it was clearly a bonded labour situation. Nowadays, the budget that you submit, or the bid that you submit, must include a reasonable recruitment fee. Now, there was an investigation done a few years ago, which I'm sure you're aware of, by Al Jazeera, called America's War Workers, which highlighted various practices, including the sort of backhand charging of these sorts of fees. So a company might well budget that amount and theoretically pay it or offer to pay it to a recruiter, but not in fact pay it. And then the recruiter may very well return money to the contractor. And there were instances of that were shown in the Al Jazeera film. So most of this stuff goes on off the books, in the margins, in the shadows. There will be very little in the way of record keeping showing bribes paid. Of course, that stuff is never done in the open. In our experience as FSI, we put together what we thought was a very comprehensive, very cost-effective recruitment and management program for TCNs, and we found for the first few years, and still now, there are relatively few takers for our services, which leads you to ask why, when there aren't that many competitors out there. If we were losing out to another ethical recruiter, well then fair enough. Perhaps we're not competitive enough, or not innovative enough, or something like that. But on the basis that FSI is in a very, very small field, and some people would say a field of one, when it comes to offering properly compliant recruitment services in the global south, to US and UK defence contractors, the fact that the FSI receives so few orders from US and UK defence contractors suggests that the others are getting their workers in a different way, and the question needs to be asked exactly how they're doing it.
As James mentioned, this system is central to places like Nepal, where many rely on these jobs. Nepal is so fundamental to the industry because of the history of Gurkha fighters. The Gurkhas are known for their bravery and military prowess. Tens of thousands of Nepalese compete each year for a spot in the British Army. This makes the Nepalese highly sought after in the defense world. We brought in Noah Coburn to talk more about the Nepalese and his research into the migrant workforce. He's an anthropologist, member of the faculty at Bennington College, and author of Under Contract, The Invisible Workers of America's Global War. Noah traveled around the globe to learn more about the plight of these workers.
So there's a whole range of people that fall into this category. The best known and the best visible are probably Nepali private security contractors, who are oftentimes referred to as Gurkhas. This builds on a British practice of recruiting Nepalis into the British Army, which continues to this day, and has been happening for over 2 centuries, and is one of the interesting ways that the American global wars right now really builds on British imperial practices. But that is sort of the ideal job for a lot of these young South Asians. And so a lot of them will go trying to find work as a security guard, but they end up doing things like working as cooks, cleaners, other forms of laborers. But really, the amount of infrastructure that's built on the back of these workers is remarkable, and the war couldn't have happened without them. So I started off in Nepal and traveled all across the country visiting people who had worked in Afghanistan, and then built up contacts there and went on to India, to Turkey, to the Republic of Georgia, and then eventually to the UK to talk to contractors on who had worked for a whole series of different companies at a series of different levels. But again, because a lot of these contracting companies don't necessarily want a lot of publicity about these workers, it's very difficult. There's no rolls of them. The Department of Defense keeps some statistics around them, but most other U.S. government agencies don't keep statistics around them. And the statistics that you can find are oftentimes very misleading because, again, the companies want to minimalize the importance of these workers.
This is a significant place when we're talking about this workforce. You mentioned Gurkhas. So people who are going into training to become a Gurkha and they don't make it, these people often end up in this type of security work. Is that right?
In this type of work, or in worse types of work. Nepal is a country where 30% of their GDP is actually remittances. so money sent back from workers who are abroad. And a lot of those workers are working in Gulf countries in construction and in labor like that. But there's also an understanding that the wages are higher wherever there's a war. So a lot of these workers try to get jobs working at providing security at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, for example, is protected by Nepalis. The Canadian Embassy is protected by Nepalis. A lot of the bases in Afghanistan are protected by Nepalis. But those are really prime jobs. And the contractors who are working for the primary contractor are oftentimes treated much, much better than those who are a couple layers down. So for the young men who can't get that initial job, they're oftentimes promised these nice positions where they're going to get paid $2,000 a month. And then they pay a broker to smuggle them into Afghanistan, essentially. But then they end up at a contractor base, which looks like a military base out in the middle of Kandahar province, someplace where they're working on a fuel dump or something like that. And what happens is when they arrive, they're told, oh, no, we're not going to pay you $2,000. We'll pay you $500 or $400 a month. And if you don't like it, there's the door. But of course, because they've been smuggled into the country, they don't have valid visas, they don't have work permits, they're nervous about the Afghan police arresting them. And so essentially the contracting company can then take advantage of that situation. And a lot of these young Nepalis end up working for months, if not years, just to pay off the debt that they acquired trying to get to the war zone in the first place. So there's this real sort of promise of high wages and riches, but oftentimes, more often than not, they end up far short of those initial expectations.
And you had mentioned before that when they do go overseas, sometimes their passport gets taken away and they're sort of stuck not being able to leave.
Absolutely. So that's a really common practice. And in fact, at the height of the war in Afghanistan, it was made easier by the fact that there were a lot of contracting flights that were flying directly into Kandahar airfield or into Bagram. So then the Nepalis wouldn't have even if they were allowed to keep their passport, either their passport was taken or if they were allowed to have it, they wouldn't have a visa with a stamp in it, which essentially meant as soon as they left the base, they could be arrested by the Afghan police. And I talked to several Nepalis who had ended up just in such a situation. So essentially what happens is if your company is mistreating you or you something like that and you complain, they essentially say, fine, leave. And then you leave and you get arrested. And this, one of the things that I found, this facilitates a massive amount of corruption, because essentially what you'll have is you'll have bosses higher up on the food chain who are taking kickbacks or working with corrupt Afghan officials. And in the meantime, all of the workers below them know that this is happening, and some of them want to report it, but they know that if they report it, they could end up in Afghan prison or end up being deported. So the managers at this level have an immense amount of power over these workers and take advantage of that.
And you had described a sort of labor camp in Kabul. Can you talk about what you saw?
Sure. So there's at the height of the war, but you find these across the world in places that are either in conflict zones or adjacent to them. So there are quite a few of these in Afghanistan, but were a lot in Jordan. And I hear there's some organized around the conflict in Yemen now as well. And essentially what it is it's just a compound where labor brokers will keep Nepalis who have either been smuggled into the country legally, illegally, or brought in on short-term visas that quickly expire. And essentially, these labor camps stuff a whole lot of mostly young Nepali men, but you also have Indians and Bangladeshis in there as well, depending upon which of the human traffickers are running it. And then contracting companies will come by and say, listen, I need 6 people who have experience in private security, or I need 6 people who have experience in construction, and they'll get picked up and brought to work at a more legitimate camp. But oftentimes, in some cases, these are actually run by Afghan criminals, and there's this mafia network that connects them to traffickers in places like Delhi. And they can be really grim places for young Nepalis who, particularly the ones with less experience, who don't know what they're getting into. They find themselves quickly in debt. And one of the young men I interviewed had been detained and essentially kidnapped by one of these brokers for months, because they have very little recourse and very difficult to escape once these brokers decide to hold you.
And that's what I wanted to get into also, how this workforce becomes susceptible to human trafficking, which sounds like what you're describing.
Absolutely. So oftentimes the jobs that are promised are simply not there. So on one level, the human trafficking initially is voluntary, where you say, listen, a broker will come to you and say, listen, I have this great job. And so you go. But as you go, all of a sudden you realize that actually they're not taking you to Afghanistan legally, and you don't have the correct paperwork. And now you're staying at in this base that has a large amount of criminal activity, and you've essentially been smuggled in. So it's a form of human trafficking where you initially agree to it, but by the time you sort of are 2 steps into it, you're increasingly vulnerable, especially if your passport's taken, and you are then all of a sudden have committed all these crimes, and the broker can always just walk away and leave you. So you then become dependent upon the broker to get you out of the country and to help you eventually pay off your debts.
We had talked about before that these Nepalis who become mistreated, that sort of information doesn't get back, and there's sort of a culture of shame.
On 2 levels that works. So I spoke, for example, with a group of Nepalis who were on a Dying Corps base that was attacked by the Taliban. And I interviewed 15 Nepalis who were there for that attack, and 3 of whom were quite badly injured. All of whom were sent back to Nepal almost immediately. So on one level, contracting companies work very hard to make sure that their workers don't speak to the press, they don't speak to researchers like myself, and so they realize that sending them back to Nepal or wherever their home country is makes it much less likely for them to talk to the press. And at the same time, if you're a young Nepali man who has been taken advantage of by a broker or has been robbed or cheated, that's also a fairly shameful thing for you. So oftentimes the workers who have bad experiences go home and don't say anything about it. Whereas the young workers who go off and they do make a little money, they like to come home and boast about it and brag about it and inflate how much they actually made. So a lot of the workers who go over come back and tell all these great stories about how terrific it was. And this encourages other workers to go and try to do the same thing that they did. But when you talk with them privately, you do a longer interview, you find out that perhaps their experiences wasn't as good as they had led their friends to believe.
And I believe I read in your book that you also spoke to brokers. Is that right?
I did, yes.
Did you get a sort of take on what was their opinion of the system?
Well, the brokers are oftentimes similar to the companies, the people who work for companies that you've interviewed already. They really only prefer to see a small piece of the puzzle. So if you get taken from your village in Nepal to Afghanistan to work, you don't deal with one broker. You might deal with 6 brokers. Because there's a broker who takes you from your village to Kathmandu. There's a broker who takes you from Kathmandu and passes you off to a broker in Delhi. And then there's a broker in Delhi who passes you off to a broker in Kabul. And so potentially the abuse comes from this sort of chain of brokers. So each of these individuals goes home at night and says, well, I didn't do anything that bad. But by adding all those pieces together, there's a great deal of exploitation that's happening, but everybody sort of turns a blind eye to it. And so while you have the American and international companies who have sort of plausible deniability where they say, well, we didn't do the exploitation directly, a lot of other people have similar plausible deniability. And there's really a need to sort of step back and look at the whole picture and what the effects of this style of American war is doing to really understand the broader long-term impacts of it.
When you talked to some of these workers, what are some of the stories or people who stood out for you?
A group of Nepalis I interviewed who were very well trained. They had fairly good experiences in Afghanistan. They made some money working primarily for Dying Corps, and they had fairly positive experiences. However, with the troop drawdown, they lost their jobs, as is logical. And one of the issues with being a contractor is once you're terminated, that relationship ends fully. There's no support for you afterwards. So they went back to Nepal And they met with the broker who had sent them originally to Afghanistan. And that broker said, well, I've got another job for you. This one's in Russia. And they thought that this was going to be very similar to their DynCorp experience. So they agreed, and they went to, hopped on a plane and went to eastern Russia, actually, and then ended up working as bodyguards for a Russian oligarch who was essentially a mafia boss. And when they arrived there, they realized they weren't given real visas. They were given student visas, and they were told to pretend to be students. And when they walked into his compound, he just handed them a whole bunch of, and they sort of demonstrated, it was very funny, pulling these guns out of a pillowcase, were unlicensed firearms. So they were now essentially conducting illegal security operations to protect this oligarch who was involved in all these criminal activities. And they hadn't known that this is what they were getting into. But you have now tens of thousands of Nepalis who worked for American contractors in Afghanistan who are now unemployed. So they're looking for work, whether that's in Yemen, whether that's in the DRC, or whether it's working for Russian oligarchs. So there's a real way in which this American style of contracting has produced a huge labor force that is now going to be running around the globe, and in many cases working against American interests, and oftentimes in even worse conditions than they were when they were working for the Americans originally.
Yeah, that is such a crazy story. And these workers have no idea if they're going to go to a sort of legitimate or illegitimate company, sort of like a job roulette.
Exactly. And just listening to some of their stories, I ended up talking mostly over Skype, but with some of these Nepalis who I interviewed first in Nepal, and then they ended up in Uzbekistan, they ended up in CAR. There's a lot that are going to China now. One of the things I cite in my book is at one point you could go on the Alibaba website, which is the Amazon of China, and you could literally order a unit of Nepali security guards online. And I went through the process and even emailed the guy who was in charge of that. So we're entering this world where the United States in a lot of ways has enabled this workforce to move around the globe and work in a whole series of conflicts that are going to be harder to monitor and understand the repercussions of.
Did you make any sort of recommendations?
I did. I'm an anthropologist, so a lot of what I was trying to do was primarily describe the system and give people a better sense of what was happening. But I do think there needs to be a much more transparency and monitoring of these types of groups. You, on some of your previous web episodes, have discussed some of the treaties that surround this. But again, those apply almost always only to the primary contractors. So there's a real need to make sure that the primary contractors aren't just subcontracting out human rights abuses, essentially. So there's a need to really understand, first of all, what the United States is doing and enabling. And some of the congressional work last decade was an interesting start, but it really stopped.
Thanks to James Sinclair and Noah Coburn for taking the time to talk with us for this episode.
And you don't want to miss our next episode. We hear from Tim Lynch, a retired Marine who spent over 7 years in Afghanistan doing security and reconstruction projects, while also running a bar and guest house called The Taj.
On Thursday nights in Jalalabad, we're talking 2007, 2008, 2009, all the NGOs would come over to the bar and we'd have a happy hour. And I'm talking 40, 50, 60 people from France, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, America, obviously. Sometimes an SF team would show up. Sometimes a Blackwater crew would show up.
Don't forget to subscribe. And while you're there, leave us a review. You can also let us know your thoughts at podcast@stripes.com. Also, follow us on Twitter for updates at Stars and Stripes.
Force for Hire's supervising editors are Bob Reed and Terry Leonard. Digital team lead and editor is Michael Darnell.
Thanks for listening.
This is Force for Hire.